Hello and welcome back to another episode of What Just Happened. I'm Samuel McVicar, and today we are going to talk Trump, Davos, Greenland, and the apparent framework for a future deal, quote unquote. President Trump announced this just hours after his speech at Davos, which our audience has undoubtedly seen on the news. Joining me for this is Lead America's analyst, Lewis Galvin. His desk recently produced a special report on this topic. So thank you very much, Lewis, for jumping in.
Hi, Sam, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, so props to your desk, Lewis. You published this report prior to Trump's apparent 180 on this at Davos. After weeks of escalating rhetoric, you forecasted that a deal would be the most likely scenario for Greenland, similar to Trump's Ukraine proposal. So let's start with that concept of a deal, as he has put it. Obviously, we don't know much about this potential future deal, but what might this look like in practice? What does each side think it's getting out of it?
Thanks, Sam. And yeah, absolutely. The headlines at the moment dominated by the events in Davos. Greenland kind of dominated the headlines over there. So you're right in pointing out that we did get our special report out in conjunction with our colleagues on the Europe desk. So it was a collaborative effort between us to cover this. And yes, of course, things are moving pretty thick and fast since that report has come out. So with the deal, or the framework of the deal that Trump has alluded to, you're right to mention that we don't actually know what this is going to consist of. We have seen reports start to emerge about what some of the early discussions have entailed and the points which the US is pressing both Denmark and Greenland on, but also the NATO alliance, because this deal is going to have a military strand as well as an economic strand. So what we've seen so far in the early reports is that there are discussions about Denmark potentially ceding pockets of territory on Greenland, or in Greenland rather, which will primarily be used for US military uses. So under the current 1951 agreement that the US has with Denmark pertaining to Greenland, the US is operating one military facility. It is able to surge assets. There isn't a cap on the number of troops or what assets that the US can deploy to Greenland. But at the moment, there is a bit of a limit regarding the infrastructure, and that is because there is only this one facility. So with the deal, we're likely going to hear a lot more about US efforts to renegotiate that agreement, to potentially expand the US's military presence in Greenland. And like we say, that could potentially include Denmark ceding pockets of territory. Very similar to what the UK has in Cyprus, where there's almost an exclave, British territory, which is fully overseen and administrated by the UK over there. That's the kind of thing that we're hearing the US could be pushing for in Greenland. As well as this, we're likely to see the US pushing NATO for more military support, because this military angle, particularly deterring Chinese and Russian influence around Greenland and the broader Arctic Circle, is another key priority for the Trump administration. So although we haven't quite seen as much detail on what that could look like, we are seeing reports and rumors that the US could seek to get NATO to emulate what it is doing, particularly in the Baltic, with the Baltic Sentry arrangement, which is essentially an uptick in intelligence sharing, an uptick in collaborative exercises between NATO partners in and around Greenland and the Arctic Circle more broadly. So they're kind of the military angles that we're likely to see start being discussed more for this agreement. But as I mentioned at the start, we're also looking at economic issues as well. So the US's national security strategy, published late last year, places heavy emphasis on access to critical minerals, which I'm sure our listeners have heard plenty about since Trump came into office, and I'm sure we'll be hearing much more about for the next 3 years. And that's because Greenland does have critical mineral deposits, so it has rare earths and other minerals as well. And we're likely to see the US pushing, particularly for priority access to investments in this industry. That's a much longer term goal, because developing the infrastructure is going to be particularly difficult due to the conditions in Greenland. You know, we have almost a mile of ice above a lot of these critical minerals. That will be very difficult to penetrate. But we're likely to see almost similar to the situation in Venezuela, where Trump is trying to incentivize US firms and private businesses to invest in this industry in Greenland. And the final strand as well is as I alluded to, the Russian and Chinese element. We're likely to see the US pushing just for NATO, just for Denmark, to essentially cap what could potentially further down the line be Chinese and Russian involvement in the critical mineral industry in Greenland as well.
Yeah, I just want to pause on that, what you said about potentially ceding some territory to the US. So if I understand you correctly, it could either be like the situation with the UK and Cyprus, where it's an administrative territory handed over to the US, or it could be more like the 1951 agreement, where the US will just go back to having quite a few bases. We just don't know which one it will look more like. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So under the current 1951 agreement, the US has the possibility to surge assets to what is coined as special defense areas. At the moment, there is only one, and that is Vidofik Space Base. But there is a possibility that renegotiating that could add additional defense agreements, or that could be kind of on the side, agreed with Denmark, where it would facilitate the building of more military facilities without ceding territorial control to the US.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So how fragile is this agreement, do you think? Trump has this pattern of kind of maximalist demands, then a bit of a climb down, and then can relaunch it kind of at a whim on social media. Do you think this will last? Do you think it will hold?
Absolutely. And in terms of the fragility, I think it is still fragile because we are still very early. Although the headlines were dominated by Trump's announcement that an agreement has already been formalized, that's not the case. It's still in very early stages. So although the rhetoric was very de-escalatory and quite positive in that sense, there's still a long way to go on this. And you're absolutely right. Trump usually approaches these negotiations with maximalist demands. He's written about it, so this shouldn't come as a surprise based on his business background. This is how he likes to reach agreements. And I think there are a couple of sticking points we can look at a little bit later when we talk about triggers, warnings, and indicators. But essentially, there are still a lot of roadblocks that could potentially crop up, particularly if the US does not perceive Denmark and NATO as well to be ceding on what the US sees as its red lines. So this is still a fragile agreement. We're not out of the woods yet, and I'm expecting this narrative to continue at least for the next few months.
Understood. So do you think that this deal genuinely avoids undermining Greenlandic Danish sovereignty, or is that just sort of diplomatic wording?
So that is quite subjective, because of course everyone has a different opinion on what constitutes sovereignty in this regard, and both Denmark and Greenland are still concerned. Even in the aftermath of Trump's announcement at Davos, both Danish officials and Greenland officials said that they were still concerned about the prospects of ceding territory to the US for these military facilities. So although that is something that is being discussed, there are still concerns within Denmark and Greenland. And of course, these are the two key players. We're seeing a lot about NATO's rhetoric and what NATO allies are saying, but essentially this is an issue for Denmark and Greenland to spearhead. So they do still have those concerns. And I suppose it will come down to the nature of what the agreement is. But I do think ceding territorial control, even if in small and isolated pockets, will certainly be contested amongst political officials in both Denmark and Greenland.
Okay. So you mentioned as part of the deal, expanded both US and NATO military presence on the island. How significant do you think that will be?
So I suspect that will be driven by US intelligence assessments about the legitimacy of the threat, the military threat that Russia and China poses in the Arctic Circle. At the moment, Greenland doesn't have the infrastructure for a major surge. There are 3 military facilities, one of which in particular is joint civilian use. So these are not facilities built for a massive surge of military assets. So again, this is still a much longer term issue. In terms of significance, increased intelligence sharing is always valuable. Collaboration is key when it comes to military matters, and an uptick in joint operations will improve interoperability between NATO allies, particularly operating in the Arctic, which is a very unique region to try and operate in compared to some more traditional battlefields. So I think this is going to be a longer term issue because the infrastructure is not quite in place. But I do see NATO offering to boost its intelligence sharing capabilities, uptick in military exercises, and potentially in the longer term, its troop presence as well.
Okay. So, along with the announcement of this potential future deal, Trump suspended his threats of tariffs. I imagine that was received with some relief. How about the deal itself? What has been the response from NATO allies, the Americans?
So the announcement has generally been met positively because it's de-escalatory, not so much to do with the nature of what an agreement could look like, but the big concern around Greenland was the prospect of the US using military force to take control of the island. That was the big concern, and that is because of what it means for the wider alliance, the transatlantic alliance, and the future essentially of that agreement. So the response was positive because Trump, for now, did rule that out. And it goes some way to actually moving into negotiations rather than what we saw pre-Davos, which was a lot of back and forth to do with rhetoric and less negotiating. So it was a lot of asking each other to climb down on the rhetoric rather than actually coming to the table and starting to discuss this issue in a more pragmatic sense. So it has generally been welcomed. Some NATO allies have been more vocally positive. Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Italy, was particularly positive about this, whereas the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, says, there is a lot more work to be done on this. So I would say, although it was positive, there is also general skepticism because we still don't know what this agreement is going to look like.
Yeah, interesting that Meloni, notable sort of friendly with Trump, is relieved, happy, and Rutte is a little more, this is a first step. Cool. Let's zoom out a bit and back up a little bit. Why has Greenland become such a strategic priority for the Trump administration lately?
So, two issues that have dominated headlines, and I think rightly so, because they were underpinned in the national security strategy. In the past, national security strategies have often just been sort of politicized documents, and perhaps previous administrations haven't fully enacted what they've written in these strategies. But so far, that's not the case with the Trump administration. So we can say with confidence that critical mineral access is one key priority, and that is because the US is increasingly attempting to decouple and reduce its reliance on other states for its access to critical minerals, particularly China. And this is going to be a dominant theme for the next few years. But we've seen the US really pushing the critical minerals angle and efforts to secure new supplies of critical minerals around the globe. So it's not just Greenland. We've seen this in a lot of different countries in the last 12 months, and will continue to do so in the next 3 years. So essentially, accessing those minerals would remove reliance on partners like China in this industry. And that also feeds into the second point, which is removing potential Chinese and Russian encroachment in and around the Arctic Circle. These are two countries which are increasingly viewing this as a priority, Russia in particular, given its proximity and involvement in the Arctic Circle, but essentially mitigating the influence that these two states have in the area. And that is also linked to trading routes. So we have, of course, the North Sea route, which the more it opens up, is opening up trade avenues, particularly for Russia and China. It's shortening the length of time for a lot of trade going via maritime routes between these partners and the wider globe. And the US essentially wants to ensure it can benefit from that whilst mitigating the influence that these states have. China has research facilities in the Arctic, as does Russia, and there are concerns that these could be dual use. So although they are framed as so far being for civilian and scientific research, they do tend to have dual-use operations that could also provide military benefits. So we think the United States is wanting to really try and mitigate the extent to which Russia and China can influence operations in the Arctic region.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about the Russia and China threat, especially from the Trump administration. How credible do you think those concerns are? How likely are Russia and specifically China are to act on getting into that space, that Arctic region?
So they are already acting on this. And that is because for China, a lot of it is research. And for Russia, it's because a lot of Russian territory falls, in or near the Arctic Circle anyway. It has a significant role for the Russian naval assets as well, particularly operating out of Murmansk. But in terms of the accusations that Trump was using over the last couple of weeks and months, that Greenland is crawling with Russian and Chinese ships, is less accurate. So predominantly for China, they are research operations, and like we say, for Russia, we do have the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, which is integral to moving its naval assets. I think the Trump administration really wants to nip in the bud the potential for escalation, because these are countries which are prioritizing the Arctic as a strategic theater for the future. And it looks to me as if the US is trying to essentially mitigate how far they can go. So that is, perhaps bolstering US military presence in the region, but also inhibiting their access to critical minerals. And the initial thought when I say that, I'm sure, will be surely Denmark, surely NATO wouldn't allow, Chinese or Russian investors to come to somewhere like Greenland to access critical minerals. And whilst I largely agree with that, having that in a framework, and an established framework spearheaded by the US, does cut that risk out almost entirely. So these are, growing concerns that I think the administration is trying to get ahead of and trying to inhibit before they can become perhaps more serious issues.
So on the security front, then, Trump, in his Davos speech and leading up to it, has repeatedly mentioned this Golden Dome system, missile defense shield. Can you explain a little bit what that is and why Greenland is kind of, in his eyes, essential to creating that?
So the Golden Dome is something that Trump has been spearheading during this term in office. It's something that made its way into the last budget as well. And the Golden Dome is essentially a new, innovative missile defense program, so a layered missile defense system. The reason Greenland is important is because when it comes to missile defense, usually the largest threats, so if it's perceived to be Russia and China, we'd be looking at the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles, so ICBMs, which generally prefer to take the shortest route upon launch to their target. That would mean, in a lot of cases, particularly if targeting the US's eastern seaboard, that these missiles would go over the Arctic Circle, and therefore having a territory within the Arctic Circle, such as Greenland, where the Golden Dome can be placed for missile interception purposes, is really important for the US's safety and protection. And at least that's the perception of the Trump administration. So I think that's why we're hearing a lot more now about the Golden Dome involvement in Greenland. And it is essentially another layer of missile defense for what the US intelligence apparatus perceives to be the most logical route for, if the US were to come under attack, the Arctic Circle would be a theater for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lewis. So the report mentions quite rightly that this Greenland issue has been the deepest transatlantic crisis in decades. So I guess what impact is this broadly going to have on US NATO relations, US Europe relations?
So Sam, I think you're right, and the narrative around this being the deepest transatlantic crisis in decades is certainly true, and that is because we saw what is the most significant military power in NATO not ruling out using military force against a NATO ally. So although, as you'll see in our report, we didn't see this to be amongst our most likely scenarios, it was still a concern. And I think that concern is what has driven the speed of negotiations, and why Greenland and the issue of Greenland took over, the World Economic Forum, which typically doesn't focus on these types of issues. And I think what it means going forward was encapsulated in various speeches, actually, by some world leaders. Mark Carney was one of the most notable to speak about this, where there is now the perception, And it has been growing under this second Trump administration. But now that we've seen this NATO or potential inter-NATO conflict come into play, this perception that, the old world order is gone. Traditional allies of the US perhaps can't rely on the US, or at least can't rely on the US not to rule out using military force against, its own allies. And I think that's going to be really concerning. And especially against the backdrop where we know Trump generally prefers bilateralism over multilateralism. And so whilst he is all in on NATO, he's managed to get them to commit to increasing defense spending. And frankly, if Trump wanted to leave NATO, I think he would. He's left literally hundreds of other multilateral fora. I do think he's still all in on NATO, but it shows that the US does have not just the capacity, but the willingness to throw its weight around to protect US interests. And I think we're now entering, or we are now firmly in, a world where US interests are not explicitly aligned with NATO interests. And that's going to be a sticking point going forward for the next, couple of years, at least whilst we've got President Donald Trump in office. This is going to cause friction because I suspect there will be more issues that crop up. We've already seen this criticism of NATO in terms of what it could do vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine. And so it's going to be a friction point, I think, for the rest of the administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carney's speech was worrying, especially in light of his recent talks with China. It seems like instead of being allied with the U.S. on economic issues with China on the other side of the fence, it's now Canada is right in the middle. And as you said, he mentioned the old way of doing things is gone and not coming back. I was in the episode with the same question. Triggers, warnings, and early indicators. What might cause another flare-up? What will your desk be watching for as this deal sort of comes to light?
Absolutely, and I think that's very important for our listeners, so they can also be monitoring the same things that we are. I think first and foremost, the rate of negotiations is going to be really, really important here. Trump has proven with both allies and adversarial states that reaching agreements fairly quickly is very, very important to him. And if there's any perception that the other party is, so-called dragging their heels, perhaps, that's a risk. And that could risk, as we spoke about earlier, Trump flipping back to maximalist demands and really aggressive and assertive rhetoric. So the rate of negotiations is going to be a key thing to watch. And also the US's rhetoric about whether it believes Denmark and European allies are not taking this particularly seriously. And this comes amid, concerns that a lot of agreements with Europe can take quite a long time. It's a famously bureaucratic behemoth to try and get through, and you've got a lot of players here trying to get involved and trying to balance their own interests. So the rate of negotiations, and at least the US's perception and rhetoric on how those negotiations are going, I think is a key indicator. And that ties into as well the second TWI that we're going to be looking at, and that is the US again increasing its rhetoric that NATO is incapable or perhaps unwilling to defend Greenland. Especially when it comes to things like the Golden Dome, which are massive investments. This military angle is going to grow in importance alongside that economic element we discussed earlier. So if there is, a flagrant or a publicized approach from the US in which it becomes increasingly clear the US genuinely does not believe NATO is capable of defending Greenland, then that's going to be another perhaps trigger and certainly a warning for the future of this Greenland situation. And then finally, if we do see an uptick in Chinese, Russian naval assets around Greenland, there's a world where these states could see this as perhaps a moment of weakness within the NATO ally. In fact, Russia has said as much, that it perceives this to be a really trying time for NATO. And there is a world where these states could start to, increase their maritime activities around Greenland to really try and test that alliance. A fragmented NATO ultimately works in favor for these states. So there is a world where we could see, these countries start and test the boundaries in Greenland's maritime areas. And the result of this would be, of course, increasing US concerns and leading back into that point I just mentioned, where there could be increasing rhetoric or belief on the US side that actually NATO is ineffective or incapable of defending the territory.
Absolutely. Well, Thank you so much, Lewis, for jumping on. And our clients I encourage them to go read this report. All these scenarios, fascinating. That should be in your inbox already. And if you are not a subscriber to the World Risk Register, contact us. We can discuss a trial, send you Lewis's report, info@civilline.co.uk. Lewis's desk will definitely be keeping an eye on this, obviously, and the myriad of other Trump initiatives, Iran, Venezuela, of course. So yeah, thanks again, Lewis, and we will speak to you next time.